Welcome to the Brain Matters webinar. I'm Dick Moberg, your host for today's presentation. Our featured panelist is Dr. Peter Smielewski, and our featured industry partner is ICM Plus, which makes perfect sense since Peter is the driving force behind that software. We'll first review a few upcoming meetings and some abstract deadlines. We'll then hear a recorded presentation from Dr. Smielewski, followed by a short presentation by Peter on the ICM Plus software. At the end, we'll have a live question and answer session with Dr. Smielewski, so please type in your questions using the Q&A tab on your screen anytime during the presentation. Now let's look at some upcoming meetings. All of these meetings are listed in the events section on our website, www.moberg.com. In August, we have the third joint symposium of the International and National Neurotrauma Societies, which is also being held in conjunction with the AANS CNS sections on neurotrauma and critical care. So we can expect a much more diverse audience this year. It's one of my favorite meetings, and it's in one of my favorite cities, Toronto. And the asset meeting for EEG technologists is in another favorite city, New Orleans, this year. Then we have an Ian Ellis course put on by UC Davis, very appropriately held at the same time as Burning Man, and very close to Black Rock City, which is my most favorite city. And of course, in September, we have the ICSD Spreading Depolarization meeting, which will be a satellite meeting just prior to the Neurocritical Care Society meeting. Later in October is the Newborn Brain Symposium at Brigham and Women's Hospital. And now some abstract deadlines. Just a few this time: June 15th for the ICSD conference, June 30th for EuroNeuro, which is in Brussels in November, and ANIM, which is in Berlin next year. The deadline is August 30th. And we are pleased to announce our next webinar well ahead of time. Dr. Brian Apabu from Phoenix Children's will talk about EEG patterns in neurocritical care. You can register now on our website for this webinar. This is a good time to remind you about our newsletter, the Neuroscience Monitor, which will keep you up to date in neuromonitoring. Your colleagues can sign up anytime on our website. If you have an event or news item related to neuromonitoring and neurocritical care, send it to us. By this time, I hope everybody has figured out how to get into the webinar, so let's move on to our featured panelist. Today's panelist is a longtime friend, Dr. Peter Smielewski. I thought the image Peter sent for us for the webinar announcement looked a bit serious, so here are some pictures I took of him over the years. On the left is at Howard Jonas's house at the TPIM meeting in 2010, and on the right is in Sujin Park's favorite Korean restaurant in Philly. So now let's start the presentation.
Hello, I am Peter Smielewski, and I'm a Senior Research Associate and co-founder of the Brain Physics Lab Department of Clinical Neurosciences, University of Cambridge, UK. We specialize in intensive care unit monitoring, data integration and analysis, and I'm the creator of a physiological monitoring data collection and real-time analysis software, ICM Plus. The software is by now licensed by Cambridge University to over 140 clinical research centers worldwide, and it incorporates all the methods of assessment of various aspects of cranial-spinal dynamics that we have been developing over the past 25 years. It's a great pleasure to talk to you today about our work on continuous monitoring of cerebral autoregulation in particular, and about our software. But before we start, a very quick disclosure. I do have some financial interest in the licensing fees for the software. My main subject of the talk is, of course, cerebral autoregulation. This is a neuroprotective mechanism against the effect of fluctuating arterial blood pressure. In a properly functioning brain, the blood flow is stable over a large range of cerebral perfusion pressures. And outside of this range, bad things happen, often very bad. And this mechanism is impaired frequently in traumatic brain injury, either entirely or more often the curve is simply modified, shifted, and the plateau shortened. So having some sort of continuous method of assessment of autoregulation at the bedside seems like a pretty good idea. And we have been working on precisely that over the past 20 years. And over the years, we have developed different approaches to it. One obvious approach, and most intuitive, is look at the cerebral blood flow measurement and look at its corresponding, the changes corresponding to changes in cerebral blood pressure or arterial blood pressure or the cerebral perfusion pressure. The various different devices produce different indices, but they all work to the same curve. Or we can look at the cerebral blood volume changes. In this case, we expect a reciprocal, so inverse relationship between the pressure and the volume. And the volume could be either measured using techniques like the near-infrared spectroscopy, again, for example, or more often using a modality that we always have available at the bedside, intracranial pressure, which could be treated because of the pressure volume curve as a surrogate of volume changes. And that gives us the index that is most known to most of you, PRX. Now, and most of you, if not all, have seen some form of this sort of relationship between the blood pressure fluctuations, it's the mean blood pressure and mean intracranial pressure, showing an inverse relationship with the good pressure reactivity scenario, and that corresponds to negative index and negative correlation coefficient. Or in the pressure passive scenario, you have a direct transmission of fluctuations in blood pressure into intracranial pressure, corresponding to highly positive index, positive correlation coefficient. What I would like to really draw attention to that this can be expressed in the form of phase shift between these two signals, and in the good reactivity scenario, it's nearly 180 degrees, so the inverse relationship, nearly because of the inertia, and this is at the point of frequency of the dominant frequency of the slow waves. And similarly here, the dominant frequency will have a phase shift of about 0 that corresponds to a passive response. And why this is important will become clear a bit later. The index can be evaluated in real time at the bedside using algorithm and ICM Plus. We have a moving window, so 5 minutes moving window, so we calculate the correlation coefficient between the two. And the correlation is done on smoothed low-pass filtered waves of blood pressure and ICP. The index, the PRX index, has been validated in experimental condition against the gold standard measurement of cerebral blood flow, single laser Doppler flowmetry, and against the lower limit of autoregulation that was detected using this modality, and show a good correspondence of a very high area of the curve. So that's very reassuring. Also, a lot of work has been done to look at the impact of PRX measurement of autoregulation and the patient outcome, and it shows much increased mortality rate with high PRX values, and also a very significant separation between a good and a bad outcome in TBI patients. That's another more recent work, as well as the time profile of PRX in patients that did not survive and patients that did. Shows a very clear, significant separation, particularly during the first few days post-injury. But what's really exciting is a very hot off the press result from our Center TBI data. So that's a large European brain trauma observational study that we have just completed the recruitment for, and we are in the process of analysis. And this is analysis of data from 22 centers, so really multi-center, 185 patients. And this time we looked at what parameters like ICP and PRX in particular introduced to the model above what the most commonly known impact model that takes into account the presentation of the patient at the start of the ICU period. What these two add in addition to what that model can explain. And you can see by the area under the curve that just using ICP increases the area under the curve a little bit, but when the PRX is added to it, this becomes highly significant. So this is really exciting because it finally it's a final proof that that index does actually have a very significant impact on outcome above everything else that we can assess. The status of autoregulation has been also recognized by the British Trauma Foundation in the guidelines as one of the important aspects that people should look into in the patient, but they did not go into any sort of details of how to do that, how to incorporate the knowledge of the autoregulation stages in management of the patient. One most obvious approach would be to plot the autoregulation status alongside with other physiological measurements and assess whether, for example, that particular level of supraperfusion pressure is safe or not, or whether trying to change and to control intracranial pressure by increasing blood pressure has any potential to work, i.e. with interrupted regulation it will, with impaired autoregulation will obviously not. And however, the more methodological approach, more thorough approach to incorporating the autoregulation into the bedside management of patient TBI is the concept of optimal cerebral perfusion pressure. This has been around now for some time, and basically what we're trying to do here is to substitute a fixed range of target pressure, of cerebral perfusion pressure, as given by the guidelines, by this individualized point. A point where cerebral autoregulation for that particular patient is at its strongest. So that would be the minimum value of the PRX and cerebral perfusion pressure curve. And we can now do these calculations not only for each patient, but in real time to provide an update of that individualized target minute by minute basis. And when we do that, we can look at how well we are managing cerebral perfusion pressure in the patient with respect to that individualized dynamic target. And we have shown in a few papers now that treating the patient close to that individualized target is beneficial for the patient, decreases mortality and also severe disability. But this is all based on the retrospective data, so no interventions here were made yet. As you can see by the number of publications, there has been a lot of interest, particularly recently in using PRX, and a lot of work has been done in this field. But also notice how many papers that quote optimal cerebral perfusion pressure approach has been, and particularly in the recent years. So again, there's a lot of interest among the intensivists there on that subject. And we've now got a dedicated website that deals with these. And I would like to encourage you to go and have a look at that. And one thing that I would like to draw attention to is our recent study. The first time, finally, we are doing a randomized trial of CPP Opt. This is only done in 3 tertiary trauma centers. And what we have to really is still not the efficacy of the treatment and its relationship to outcome, but we want to make sure that the approach of using individualized target given by the CPP Opt is feasible and that we can manage that, the bedside. We can control the pressure close to the CPP op target, and that this approach is safe. Only when we have established this first aims, then we can move on to the next proper randomized trial, see a relationship, prospective relationship with outcome. So all seems well and good so far. We've established, we've got the index of autoregulation, established that it's got a very high impact on outcome, and we now have potentially a way of incorporating into clinical management of patient. But there are still problems, unfortunately, with this methodology. And you can see that immediately a problem is emerging when you look at the trend of the CPP opt calculated from 4 hours as originally proposed. There are large gaps in these trends. And we have found that in 560 patients that we've looked at, on about 60% of time, we had a recommendation. And out of this, only 70% were based on proper U-shaped curves. Why is that? Well, because the physiology doesn't always want to play the ball, really. And you have pictures like this. In this case, there is no way we can distinguish any U-shaped curve, and neither here, perhaps a little bit there, but not so much. However, this is still important information. The patient autoregulation was lost across the whole period here and across the whole range of CPP values. So there isn't any optimal cerebral perfusion pressure point that we can distinguish here. On the other hand, there, the autoregulation was preserved, all green here, across all the time and the CPP values, which means that we are okay, really, with the brain perfusion, and we should worry about something else for a change. Now, in reality, what also matters very much is the dynamic range of cerebral perfusion pressure. Because if we look at the 4 hours period, for example, the range is barely 10 millimeters of mercury. This is not sufficient to give any reliable recommendation of CPP-opt. But if we move up a little bit to a longer period of 6 hours, the same data, just going back a little bit further, the curve appears. And this was this formed the base of the concept that our colleagues from Leuven proposed in a data car algorithm, and later also incorporated in ICM Plus, where we take not just one window, single 4 hours in our case, but windows extending back from 2 hours all the way to 8 hours or more. And we perform calculation repetitively of the CPP-opt, and then average these values using a weighted sum. And the weighting algorithm takes into consideration the duration of the calculation window, but also how well the fit was, so the error fit, as well as the shape of the fit itself. And using this approach, we can now generate trends that are a lot more continuous, which is very good practical reason. If the clinicians arrived and wants to decide on a target for treatment, it's rather disheartening to see that no such targets can be offered. But also the trend is a lot more stable, at least it seems to be. But I really want to go beyond just tracking down the value. So this here, you've got a cerebral perfusion pressure, as before shown, and the optimal value. So you can see in this patient how the CPP oscillated around the CPP-opt. And the question is, are these excursions from the CPP-opt target important or not? And you can gain some sort of idea about that if you look at the extension of the concept, i.e. the limits of autoregulation. And so if we draw a line that demarcates the impaired and preserved autoregulation, you can calculate those values. And if you then plot those on top, and that's the green band here, you can see that the cerebral perfusion pressure was in reality, despite its variability, pretty much most of the time within that range, except for a few periods where perhaps the patient was a bit more vulnerable and attention should have been given to that. But let's go back further to the basics. And let's face it, PRX is a very noisy parameter. If we smooth it, it looks better and certainly gives us more confidence in looking at the trend of autoregulation as such. But this is not really the fix. And that's because of several fundamental issues and things that needs to be understood. PRX relates changes in volume to changes in pressure, not flow, which means that we can still see the vessels, arterial vessels reacting and volume changes due to changes in arterial blood pressure. However, these changes may not be effective enough, may not be sufficient enough to sustain the cerebral blood flow at a constant level, and therefore the autoregulation may in fact be lost despite of good autoregulation index. And that's something that you need to be kept in mind. Also, this index relies on adequate transmission of volume change into intracranial pressure, and it may not work through circumstances of high compliance. Relies on the assumption of that variability is purely due to map changes, which may not always be the case. And therefore, PRX index close to zero may either reflect working autoregulation or incoherent variability of an ICP and blood pressure. The latter effect we can approach and try to address using the relationship between these two the signals that is considered within the frequency domain. That is, within the frequency domain, we can look at the coherence between waves at different frequencies, and we can try to ensure that the fluctuation in blood pressure and ICP is coherent before we make a decision whether that index is reliable and is reflecting the transmission of fluctuation from blood pressure to ICP. In this particular example, we have this is from an experimental work, blood pressure gradually lower to terminal values. And here we have an image of coherence and high resolution in time and frequency. And when the coherence was required to be of a particularly high value, you can create a mask from this image and use that mask to block out, to remove all the values, in this case, of phase shift. And this is why I said earlier that this would be important. If we remove all the phase shift values that come from incoherent fluctuations in blood pressure and ICP, then we should arrive at a much more reliable, robust assessment of this relationship. And if we do that, average phase across all the frequencies of interest, and look at the time evolution of this phase, we can, with a little bit of mathematical manipulation, in this case, we applying a cosine to the phase shift to bring the values to the same range as PRX, we can directly compare the two approaches. And you can see that as PRX, the autoregulation initially is preserved and then it gets lost when the blood pressure goes down. But notice one important thing: this is a lot more stable than the standard PRX. When we looked at the performance of this index across a cohort of TBI patient, we have seen a very similar performance, but slightly better. So the area under the curve is a little bit better than PRX in this case. Same thing can be seen using the area under the curve pictures, and you can see the PRX and the WPRX clearly a high area. But more importantly even is that the WPRX seems to be significantly more stable. This is the standard deviation of WPRX versus PRX. Okay, but let's try to now address the problem of high intracranial compliance, because that's something that is important for patients undergoing decompressive craniectomy. How we can deal with that? Well, first have a look at an example where clearly there was a high compliance condition. ICP was very low, and you can see that the blood pressure fluctuations there are not visible at all here, and only become visible for higher values of ICP. But notice this is an amplitude of the pulse wave of ICP, and you can see the corresponding fluctuations clearly here. So this is what we've done. We used, instead of ICP, we used the pulse wave of ICP in the correlation between with the blood pressure, and we call that Parkes correlation coefficient. It doesn't use the peak-to-peak value. It uses the first fundamental harmonic amplitude of the pulse wave. So there, now we can replace ICP, as in PRX, with the amplitude of the ICP, and we get a very similar value in this particular case. But why does it work? Well, to understand that, one has to look at how the pulsation in pressure gets transmitted into blood volume, and this can be described as a lump quantity called compliance of the arterial blood. This compliance can be described by the inverse relationship to between the pressure and the compliance, clearly nonlinear, and below the critical closing pressure, it collapses. But we really want to look at these part of the curve. What you can see here is that as the blood pressure or cerebral perfusion pressure increases, the arterial compliance decreases, and therefore the transmission of the pulse into blood volume decreases, and vice versa. So just with the modulation of the mean value of cerebral perfusion pressure, you get changes in transmission of the pulse. And that is important because then we can augment this particular mechanism of transmission of blood volume changes into volume into pressure, which may fail with high compliance condition. We can augment that with this mechanism of augmenting the pulse transmission, which is independent of the brain compliance. And so because of that, it compensates to some extent for the poor volume to pressure transmission when you superimpose these two mechanisms together. And when you compare the two indices and their performance in TBI patient, you can see that they perform similarly, but the new index performs better. And the cerebral perfusion pressure statistically, the optimal cerebral perfusion pressure chart is very similar. But we can go even one step further, and now instead of looking at the relationship between the pulse amplitude and blood pressure, it sort of makes sense to look at the cerebral perfusion pressure instead, just because it is the cerebral perfusion pressure, in fact, that drives the changes in the characteristic of the brain compliance and changes that compliance. So if we do that, then we now exchange both the blood pressure for CPP and the ICP for the pulse wave of ICP, and we have an index that we call RIC, again showing a similar relationship like PRX. But one thing has to be understood here. The correlation between amplitude and of the pulse and the cerebral perfusion pressure, if examined closely, This is the Pearson correlation coefficient definition. If you examine this closely, and using some mathematical jiggery-pokery and expansion of cerebral perfusion pressure into the difference between blood pressure and ICP, you will find that this index essentially represents both PAX, or autoregulation index, and RAP, which is the correlation between amplitude and the pulse and mean intracranial pressure, which represents the brain compensatory reserve. If you haven't come across this index before, this essentially tells you which part of the pressure volume curve we are at. And at 0 is good compensatory reserve. 1 is already the brain is tight, so the compensatory reserve is poor. And when the vessels collapse, it turns into negative. And you can see how that works with the brain edema reversing. ICP drops down, and RAP becomes 0 from positive. So again, the brain becomes less tight. Now, when you again look at the clinical relationship, outcome relationship of the ICM compared to PRS, you can see that it performs even better than PAX. And again, we have a very similar shape, perhaps a little bit sharper here for RAC than PRX. So perhaps this is something to look out for in the near future, further research, clinical validation. Now, at the end, I would like to draw your attention to the most recent development in transcranial Doppler, the robotic TCDs, new generation. And the important part of it is that robotic element, which essentially allows the measurements of transcranial Doppler flow velocity to be extended over a period, not as it is now of half an hour to an hour, but over a period of several hours, because this mechanism will adjust the flow velocity recording and keep it stable over hours. It's an example of that. 4 hours, you can see at the beginning, and at the end, the pulse is just as clean and pure. So now with this, we can do something similar to what we've done with PRX and look at the relationship of the CPP. And why would we want to do that? Well, because this is a true autoregulation. So here we've got a correspondence of the flow regulation to CPP. And perhaps this is something that may become important and useful in the near future. So the message is to take home: monitor of cerebral autoregulation is feasible and recommended. Many possibilities exist, but using ICP makes most sense as it's free. The most promising approach of integrating autoregulation TBI management is individualizing CPP targets. The concept has been proven so far in a large cohort and against the impact model in a multi-center study. But the still problem exists, and efforts are being made to address those issues, but the story is not over. And finally, a general message that the bedside availability of configurable tool like ICM Plus facilitate transition of research into clinical practice. I would like to extend my thanks to all our colleagues in the brain physics lab in Cambridge and all our fellows and collaborators worldwide that contributed to the research, our research over the past over 2 decades. And I would like to invite you to our workshop in September, where we'll be, over the course of 2 days, we'll be playing with different data sets and trying to analyze data from different angles to understand how we can extract the features better and how to understand what we monitor with our expensive toys at the bedside. And that will bring me to the end of this part of the talk. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Peter. At this point, please get your questions ready so we can review them prior to the Q&A session, which will start in 2 to 3 minutes. We'll move now to a presentation, again by Peter, on the ICM Plus software.
And in this part of the talk, I would like to talk to you briefly about ICM Plus software itself and its connectivity with CNS Monitor. ICM Plus is a piece of software that allows to integrate data from various bedside monitors and provide a configurable engine for performing real-time analysis and feature extraction from these waveforms and plotting it in real time. Now, one thing here that is particularly difficult for users is the connectivity to the monitors. This is because it's essentially a piece of software, and each of the monitors come with their own different connectivity issues, cables, etc., etc. So really, this part is not trivial. So now, if we remove that and instead we have a wonderful CNS monitor instead that takes care of all of that, then ICM Plus can only be hooked up and fixed in a fixed way to the CNS monitor and merely provides a calculation engine and with all the additional indices that we can that we have developed over the years. In this case, you've got the best of both worlds. You've got all the analytical tools that ICM Plus provides, and the ease of use and the clinically approved data collection tool. So how do we practically do that? Well, we hook ICM Plus laptop to a Moberg, just using a network cable directly or via the network infrastructure, and then configure data collection from CNS monitor. What waveforms we want to collect, and start, and that's it. And then we've got signals that are being pulled in real time, and also various indices like PRX and others that I've talked to you about can be then seen in real time on the screen, in addition to what you get on the CNS monitor screens. All of this is described in the standard of procedures, all the details. Now, another way that you can take advantage of the tool is using ICM Plus to process archive CNS monitor data. And this can be either to open the data, select variables to browse and browse them using ICM Plus tools, or you could use or configure data analysis and run the analysis to recalculate various indices that I've been talking about on the data that's been already collected by the CNS monitor. And you can learn a lot more about this if you visit our website. And thank you very much for listening to me again.
Thanks, Peter. And of course, more information can be found on our website, www.moberg.com. So once again, please send in your questions for Dr. Smielewski, and we'll now go live to Peter in Cambridge. And we appreciate Peter staying up this late on a Friday evening to answer everybody's questions. So thanks again, Peter. So let's try this. We'll now go live.
Hello, everyone. It's, as I said, it's a great pleasure to talk to you today. We've got quite a few questions coming in, so I'm just going to go from top to bottom as far as I can go because we don't have that much time. So let me just start from the top one. The question is, calculation of PRX requires presence of slow waves in blood pressure and ICP. What if they are very low, below the noise level? Well, the simple answer is the index is then unreliable, and that's why that was one of the things that I tried to address in the talk. And perhaps using tools like the coherence analysis might just fish out these unreliable points of time where we really should not be relying on PRX. move on to the next. The next question was the patients with CPP greater than CPP optimal were shown to have a greater chance to end up severely disabled in the charts shown. Is it too high CPP that makes them disabled, or is it that CPP is greater because they do not do very well and the intensivist push the pressure up as a therapeutic measure? And this is a very good question, and a question that I cannot give you an answer to because, well, we have no grounds to make this distinction at present, because they both happen at the same time, particularly in our so far retrospective analytical study of the data. So what's more, in our extended data set that we've been looking at, often what we see is that treating the patient below the lower limit, below the CPP opt, is a lot more detrimental, i.e. contributes to mortality. But the relationship between the poor outcome and a high CPP is not as clearly established and not always come up as clear as the initial study. And therefore, if you look at one of our recent paper, we started going away from just going after one CPP opt point, but going and looking after looking for the lower limit of autoregulation, the upper limit of autoregulation. And if you do that, then if you treat the patient above the lower limit of autoregulation, then the patient has got a lot better chance to do better. Now, the same cannot be very clearly, distinctly said about the upper limit of autoregulation. At least we cannot prove that, but it's in some way intuitive to all the intensivists that pushing the pressure up to high value is not a good idea. And as you know, there are therapies that try to avoid overloading the patient anyway. So even though we do not have a really clear and stable evidence for the higher limit, it's intuitive, and perhaps we will find it using different approaches. Next question: is there a period of observation before CPP opt recommended by ICM Plus? Well, we started with trying different single windows, ranging from 2 hours going all the way up to 8 hours. We established that when we go to about 4 hours, just by looking at the relationship to outcome, looking at the deviation of CPP from the CPP opt and that relationship with outcome, we established that 4 hours seems to be the happy optimum. Perhaps not as sharp, but still enough data is there to create most of the time the curves, but it's short enough to still be considered the present state. Nevertheless, that by itself, as you've seen, creates problems with the curve being often not available. So we are now looking at, as you've seen, at the extendable windows going back all the way to 8 hours, but we're penalizing the longer window. Another question says, it seems CPP recommendations by ICM Plus fluctuate a lot. So would this involve making changes very frequently to get target CPP opt? For example, changing rates of vasopressors drips every 5 minutes or so? Well, obviously not. What we do in our current CPP opt trial, we have a set of hours, every 4 hours in fact, where we assess the new recommendation. So every 4 hours, the intensivist looks at the charts. In this particular case, what we're doing, we're just providing a value going by the value available that particular point of time, and that value would be the next recommended individualized threshold. But one can imagine that during this review, one may not just look at one value, but may look back at the history and looking at the low or high limit of autoregulation and make a decision based on that. That would average out what's happening during this 4 hours if one particular value isn't doing that already. In general, even though we develop algorithms to help to summarize the physiology and what we see as one number, I tend to be rather wary of just going by one number without a possibility of some sort of assessment how reliable that number is, and having a graphical representation of that in forms of history trends would probably work best so far. The next question. So the next question is: PRX is good, but not everyone has intraventricular monitoring, and respectfully, PRX cannot be calculated. Well, if we do not have intracranial pressure monitoring, then, well, indeed, PRX cannot be calculated because ICP is part of it. But there are other ways of gaining the same sort of similar insight, and you have seen in one of my first slides this whole range of different monitors that we could use. And in one of the last slides, I even said that perhaps transcranial Doppler might be available in the future to do that. But you've got near-infrared spectroscopy that works very well, and there are some methodologies that measure brain impedance and other insights, other little different type of windows into the brain blood flow and blood volume surrogates. So yes, no PRX, but other means may exist. Another question, is there a way to exclude areas of artifacts from real-time calculations of CPP opt? Well, yes, there is, within ICM Plus, there's a concept where at every level of calculations, every parameter can be given a valid range. So, for example, we use this approach for detection and removal of arterial line flashing episodes. We first identified that arterial line flashing is characterized by the pulse dropping to 0. So the mean value of arterial blood pressure is still within range, but pulse disappears. So if we try to detect the pulse, and if we see that the pulse is below the level that we set, so the value for the pulse amplitude would be set at a certain value to make sure the turn value is within that range, then we can use that information using another function in ICM Plus. For those people that are using it, it's called isNum3, which uses parameters like a pulse wave, amplitude, and perhaps other feature extraction functions to remove values from parameters like mean blood pressure, for example. So then we have mean blood pressure multiplied by this function, which removes the mean value of blood pressure when pulse disappears. And this is perhaps easier to see as a formula than me hand waving and talking about it, but that mechanism allows you to create fairly complicated algorithm for detecting certain artifacts. Now, one can imagine that one could extend functionality of ICM Plus using a plug-in approach and create a function that would look at the whole pulse wave, for example, or other shapes of the waveforms, and flag these particular periods as artifact, and that can be fed in the same mechanism into the calculations. There's a question about the robotic TCD. Well, the particular one that I have used in my presentation is by Multigon, or as it's known in the States, or Delica. It's a Chinese company. But I know that there are other efforts as well out there that are trying to achieve similar results. So absolutely, please watch this space, and I'm very excited that this is happening. Another question here, it's very, very valid. Has any work been done using neural networks, expert system, or artificial intelligence in general to distill the measurements and patterns of measurements into something simple for clinical use? Well, this is what we, and not just us, but other people are looking very heavily into. And yes, this is the way that things are going. We started off with taking a very high dimensional data sets, i.e. the time series waveforms of high frequency sampling to 200 hertz or more. And we went and folded them into one index. Then we created another index and another index. And we have created quite a lot of indices, as you've probably seen coming in from our lab and others. So now, if you add this into the physiological information that you have on by the bedside anyway, it turns out that now we've already again exceeded the level of number of features, number of parameters that the clinicians can take in to decide on what to do and what the patient state is. And so the way forward, and we have also started looking into it and got a paper in the publication process, we are looking at way of summarizing all of these parameters into a concept of a state, where this becomes in a way a smart alert, which does not necessarily explain to you what's happening, but it tells you that the combination of values of the indices means that something is happening to the patient. And then it's for you to go into the individual indices, look at the chart, and find out which bit of physiology is not functioning and try to fix that with appropriate treatment. I'm very much aware of the time. I think we're running quite low, so I'm not sure how much we have in there. I can probably answer another question or two. There is a question here: could this kind of data be shared on worldwide basis for collaboration between researchers? In brackets, perhaps a naive question. Well, we are as a field, we are opening to these possibilities. The point here is that the data has to be collected, first of all, in such a way that allows it to be shared out, and that alleviates a lot of problems that we have been facing in the past with making it more open. We do collaborate with lots of people, lots, as I have acknowledged in my slide, and we share various data in various ways with them. A lot of the time, we want people to get to come to us, and either remotely or come to brain physics, because like then they become part of our brain physics family, and we can move together a lot better and faster. But there are also multi-center randomized observational studies like Center TBI or Track TBI in the States, which from the start creates the principle of such a database shared. I am not sure, Dick, how long I should continue with this. I've got more questions coming through, and that is a bit of a problem. So if you could alert me, Dick, in the text chat here, if you want me to carry on for much longer.
Peter, I think another one or two questions would be fine. Thank you.
Okay, so that's that. What is the current cost of acquiring? Okay, I think this is not so much of a scientific question. It's a question about the cost and the licensing. Well, just best is to get directly to me. We license, or Cambridge Enterprise licenses ICM Plus on a per research group basis, and there's one flat fee of $7,500. At the moment, is perpetual. But if you want to keep receiving new versions after the first 2 years, then there is some additional small fee involved per 2 years to keep us going and developing the software. Okay, next question. Okay, the question here is, no question that TCD can be used for ICP evaluation, not qualitatively, but not quantitatively, but qualitatively. Yes, that is correct, but that's not what I was trying to say. I'm not in this talk. I'm not even trying to approach the issue of using transcranial Doppler to replace ICP as such. What I was trying to say is that transcranial Doppler may replace a modality for monitoring of cerebral autoregulation, because PRX isn't really one. It reflects reactivity of the arterial bed, not so much autoregulation. These two go hand in hand, but not always the same. So this is what I was trying to say here. There's work being done about TCD and ICP evaluation that I don't want to go into here at all because of the time. There is another question here. Can bifrontal non-invasive cerebral oximetry monitors be used to calculate autoregulation similar to PRX? They seem to be simple to use and have universal application, but limited as the values are only for frontal lobes. Yes, you could, and I've listed it as one of the indices. And in a scenario where you have no possibility of using continuous ICP monitoring, then absolutely other measures like non-invasive oximetry is very useful. And in particular, when in a bifrontal case, you've got another advantage that you can look at both hemispheres and look at the side-to-side asymmetry. And we have seen in quite a few presentations over the years already that the asymmetry in the brain actually does matter and may be that extra important factor to take into account in your monitoring. So absolutely yes, there's work being done on that too. Yeah, if absolutely. Okay, well, one more question here. I've got. What about monitorization in aneurysmatic subarachnoid hemorrhage and vasospasm? Is there any difference in the sites where you put the sensor, the calculation for global autoregulation? Well, in SAH patients, in very poor grades, you still have often full neuromonitoring. So you still have ICP and you have PRX and you have this sort of global measure. But a lot of the time in SAH patients, it is TCD that is used because it can keep doing the measurements after the patient is taken out of the unit. In terms of the intensive care, in terms of the vasospasm detection, and more actually accurately, not so much vasospasm, but severity of the vasospasm impact on the patient. This is where the monitoring of autoregulation can help. Vasospasm we can detect just using transcranial Doppler values, absolute values, and looking at Lindegaard ratio, etc., and obviously confirm them later with angiography. But it depends on the state of the vasculature and the strength of the and the health of the cerebral autoregulation. That will then make the patient more vulnerable to delayed ischemia or not. And again, there are papers out there that shows that these two together are helpful as extra monitors and extra parameters to monitor. Just scanning here. As I've done this, there is a question here. If you take ICP into frequency domain using fast Fourier transform, could you create a display similar to compressed spectral array as it's now used for EEG? Yes, possibly. We have not played with that much. But perhaps the nature of ICP signal is a little bit different to EEG, and we have a very well-defined bands of frequency that relate to different physiologies with the ICP waveform, and so we can directly go after particular range when we want to go after particular physiology. So I've talked about the cerebral regulation, well, that relates to the slow waves. But with the pulse, you can look at things like brain compliance and look at the pulse morphology and as well as indices in Fourier domain or others that would reflect the brain compliance and be available as a parameter in real time. I am not sure whether using compressed spectral array would actually add anything to it, just because we've got such well-defined metrics for different waves of ICP. But there's a lot of work still being done on ICP. We have been doing work on ICP waveform analysis for decades, and there's still exciting things to do. So hey, maybe this will be another way of looking at it that will open new insights. I think I have covered most. If I've missed something, I do apologize. Yeah, I think I've covered the main questions that coming in, other than various hellos and similar greetings, which I will not read out aloud for now. So if there are no further questions, I think, Dick, you could probably summarize. And I thank you so much for listening. And please send me your questions privately, and I'll be very happy to answer all of those as soon as I can.
Thank you very much, Peter, and we really appreciate you taking your Friday evening and spending it with us. I should say that Peter will be at the Neurocritical Care Society meeting, and we'll be conducting a workshop there. And thanks to all of our participants for joining us. This was one of our largest and most popular webinars. A recording of this webinar will be available on our website within a week. If you have suggestions for topics relevant to neurocritical care monitoring, please get in touch with us at info@moberg.com. This is our disclaimer, so read it quickly. And I just wanted to remind you again of our next webinar, and we'll see you at that webinar on July 27th, featuring Dr. Apalu. Thanks again to Peter and all of you for your participation.
Thank you.